Hi, I'm Alden Jones, and I'm here to talk about The Wanting Was a Wilderness, which is my third book and will be the basis of the craft lectures at the Newport MFA's June 2020 residency. So I want to start by talking about how this book came about. I was approached by Fiction Advocate, by Brian Hurley, who's the editor of Fiction Advocate, and he introduced me to this idea that they had of this new series where they were going to ask book critics, who are also writers themselves, to engage with a text that wasn't too far in the past, something within the past like 20 or 30 years, and with this extra room to meander and do kind of whatever you want. So I chose Wild, and I chose it without reading it because I'd been wanting to read it for a long time, and I'd been putting off reading it. And the reason was I had gone on a very similar journey when I was young, when I was 19. Though it wasn't similar in that it was not a solo journey. It was an organized educational program, and I was one of several people. I was one of 12 people in the crew plus 2 leaders, but it was an 85-day journey where, we went caving, we hiked and hiked and hiked, we went canoeing on rapids and also in the Everglades. We ultimately climbed a volcano in Mexico called Iztaccíhuatl. I'd always known I was going to really have to re-engage with that material and that time in my life when I read Wild. I knew it was going to bring back a lot of memories. I had already really liked Cheryl Strayed's work. I had read her essays. In particular, the essay The Love of My Life was a staple in my creative writing classes. I absolutely love that essay, and I just knew I was going to like the book. So when Brian Hurley came to me and asked me to pick a book, I automatically picked Wild. And when I began writing, I had this very simple approach that I knew was not going to be enough to sustain the whole project. But I knew it would get me started, and that was just to sort of categorize what I wanted to talk about with Wild, and looking at things like being a woman alone, what the wilderness can teach you about the inner life, things like that. And I knew that somehow this book was gonna have to be more than just a back and forth, like here's some criticism about Wild, here's some insight that I have from having gone on a similar hike. And as I kept writing, I realized that the story was really about how to write a memoir. It was about how to tell a story in a way that so many people can connect with it. Something like Cheryl Strayed's Wild, a lot of people fantasize about doing something like hiking the PCT, as Cheryl Strayed did, but whether or not you related to that, it was so easy to relate to this persona. So I wanted to understand, by writing, how did she achieve that? So I began to break down elements of memoir and also things that you need to do in your life in order to tell a true story. And I kept coming back to the idea of authenticity. It was something that Dear Sugar, Cheryl Strayed's alter ego, was always encouraging of her, the people who wrote her letters, was to live an authentic life, to live authentically with what you had to work with. And that's exactly what Wild illustrated. And the more that I wrote, the more that I had to do this double reckoning, where I realized that something in my life at the time of the writing needed to change. And also I had to admit a lot of truths about who I was when I was 19 that I'd rather gloss over or rewrite. So I had to make a big change in my life, which created a big upheaval, and I had to stop writing. So I was about halfway done with The Wanting Was a Wilderness, and I came back to it almost 2 years later with a new approach of this is really about how to tell a story authentically. And my trajectory in this book, this little tiny book that I wound up writing, was to figure out how to tell my story truthfully by looking at Cheryl Strayed's story and seeing how she did it, doing some things similarly, doing some things differently, but looking at the idea of reckoning. How can I use this idea of reckoning to encourage other writers to see how they can tell their story truthfully? So in the end, it became it's a critical work. It's a craft book. It's also ultimately a memoir. It's me trying to tell my story by breaking down Cheryl Strayed's story and looking at how she did it as I build my own story. And I got to revisit a lot of material I never figured out how to tell in nonfiction before. I'd written about my Outward Bound experience in fiction, but it was easy to reduce my crew and me to this, complaining, immature, bratty group, which was not all there was to us. In the end, I think I had to write in order to figure out what I wanted to say, which doesn't always work when you're writing a book. Sometimes you need to know where your X, Y, and Z are gonna be. I knew, like Cheryl did, that the end of the trail was partially the ending, but I think the hardest thing about this book was figuring out how to end it authentically and not just neatly. And so what I did was include several false endings, things I could have done to end the book that wouldn't have been truly how things were. So I hope that this will spark some discussions about authenticity. I'm also going to be talking about how to write about literature, how to write beyond the book review, and how do we take craft and use craft as a method of authenticity by methods such as defamiliarization.